Well, we have to drink the coffee or it's not a real episode. Hello, and welcome to Did Shakespeare? I'm that Shakespeare girl, Cassidy Cash. We know there are four versions of King Lear, and you've seen this if you're following me on Twitter, we've been talking about that this week, the fact that there were four versions of the play published while Shakespeare's contemporaries were alive, published by people who knew Shakespeare personally. One of those was even printed while Shakespeare himself was alive. And we know that printing plays was often a way for rival playing companies to sort of wreak havoc on each other by getting their play out to the public faster or more broadly than what the playing company would have liked. So publishing was also a little cutthroat, a little underhanded. So this week, we're asking the question, did Shakespeare publish his own plays? Depending on how you count them and whether or not you include Two Noble Kinsmen and Cardenio, Shakespeare wrote 37 plays. Almost half of those were published during Shakespeare's lifetime. Some of the earliest published plays were published in 1594. Those include Titus Andronicus, Richard III, Henry VI Part 2, and Henry IV Part 1. All of these got published when Shakespeare was 22 years old. This was the same year that the Lord Chamberlain's Men was formed after the outbreak of plague closed the theater, killed a bunch of the members of the Queen's Men, and all but completely imploded the Queen's Men. They went with their popularity almost as a direct result of the plague. And the Lord Chamberlain's Men was put back together after the plague from basically the best of the people who didn't die. And so that company was formed in 1594, the same year that these four plays were printed. The following year, Shakespeare would be publicly acknowledged as a leading London playwright. So this was when he was really getting his wheels under him and he was starting to be this very famous, very popular writer in London. Some others of Shakespeare's plays that got printed during his lifetime, and this was surprising to me, include Romeo and Juliet, Love's Labour's Lost, Henry V, Henry VI Part 2, Henry VI Part 3, Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, Merry Wives of Windsor, Hamlet, King Lear, Troilus and Cressida, and Pericles. That's a whole lot of Shakespeare to be circling around for different people to read. Are you surprised? I know I was surprised. When you read about Elizabethan England, you hear a lot about how illiterate they were and how they didn't read. And I'm just thinking, this is a lot of published written material for a society that couldn't read. I'm questioning a little bit exactly how illiterate the society really was. Maybe a majority of the population wasn't literate, but I'm thinking the power holders were definitely literate because this was a lot of time and a lot of expense to put books into circulation at all. So somebody thought it was important and somebody was definitely reading it. But anyway, the illiteracy of 17th century London is a topic for another week. There are a few key points that you want to remember. First, is that not all of the works were required to be authorized. So just because something got printed with Shakespeare's name on it doesn't mean that Shakespeare wrote it, doesn't mean Shakespeare knew about it personally. In fact, some people would actually print works and put Shakespeare's name on it and say, oh, I wrote this thing and Shakespeare wrote this, to capitalize on Shakespeare's fame because they could sell more books if it had Shakespeare's name on it. And it was just a complete lie. Shakespeare didn't write it at all, and these people would know that and put it on the book anyway and then circulate it out there to try and capitalize on his fame. Additionally, copyright laws were all messed up during this time period. For example, if you wrote it down, it was basically putting those words into the public domain. No one had to ask your permission to use the language that you wrote if it was written down. It was all considered up for grabs, which is basically why Shakespeare could borrow from some of the older written works and not be considered plagiarizing, because it wasn't plagiarism then. It wasn't this sacred thing to have written down the words and them be your words. If you wrote them down, you basically put them out in the public domain and said, anybody can use these. So basically, since this was the case, and this was how the publishing industry worked, some rather unscrupulous people would go and basically get an audience member or an actor from the playing company to tell them about what the lines were in the play, and then they would write them down and they would publish it out as, this is Shakespeare's play, such and forth. And really what it is they've gone and taken different accounts from the actors and the audience members and pieced together this play and said, this is Shakespeare's, when it may or may not have actually been what had gotten performed on stage at that time. What it really was John on the last row in section F said, this is what he thinks he heard. But it happened, which is why the 1623 First Folio is really what you hear about when people say, when did Shakespeare's plays get published? They refer to the 1623 First Folio because that was the first authorized Shakespeare said this is real version. It was published by two of Shakespeare's friends. They worked with Shakespeare. They were in his playing company, and they published this to honor him, and they published him to let his legacy continue. And this one is basically, you know, you hear about authorized biographies where the person you're writing it about knows you're doing it. This was basically the version of Shakespeare's plays that Shakespeare gave his stamp of approval to this published account. So that's why there's a little bit of discrepancy when you read Shakespeare history. On the one hand, you'll hear people say, oh, his plays didn't get printed until after he died. But then on the other hand, there's over half of his plays we can find copies of that were printed during Shakespeare's lifetime. That's why. Not all of the plays were authorized copies. They were just copies. So what exactly are you reading when you go to the library or a bookstore and you pick up a copy of Shakespeare's plays? Well, that's an excellent question. The way that that works is you'll notice in the front of the copy of a Shakespeare play that you pick up at the bookstore or at the library, there's a list of editors. And the reason why there are a list of editors is because it was that person's job to sort of sift through all of this, the fake copies, the real copies, the authorized copies, and to help you navigate things like 17th century language. You'll notice in most of the modern copies, they've actually updated some of the phrases and the language just a little bit in order to make it more accessible to a modern audience. So what you read in a modern version of the play may not be exactly the phrase that you'll find in even the 1623 folio version. But the editor, their job is to help make sure that you are getting the most accurate version of Shakespeare that they can provide to you. And that's what the editor does. So when you're reading Shakespeare, you can feel pretty confident that you're reading actual Shakespeare. You're learning about William Shakespeare and what he wrote. But I will say it's a lot of fun to go and look at some of the older versions, especially the different folios and quarto versions of Shakespeare's plays, and to compare the differences and the variations and ask questions about, well, how does that change what we think we know? Or how does that change how we've thought about this particular play? Did King Lear really say this? Or maybe he said it this way over here. One really interesting example are some major variations in Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. The one in the 1623 version is drastically different from some of the ones that were published during Shakespeare's lifetime. And those differences are exciting and fun to study and to explore and to ask questions about. So I encourage you to go out there and find some of these different copies and explore them. Some places to do that would be Brown University's library has several folio versions you can go and look at. The Folger's Shakespeare Library is another great place to look at resources on Shakespeare and different copies of his plays. But wherever you go, I do encourage you to get out there and explore Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm that Shakespeare girl, Cassidy Cash, and as always, it's been a joy speaking with you today. I hope you learned something valuable about Shakespeare, and I'll see you next week. Hey guys, I'm so glad you watched this video. If you liked this video and would like to see more about Shakespeare, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. I drop videos every Saturday morning, and I would love to share it with you. So make sure that you go there. Also, over at CassidyCash.com, I have freebies, and I put them there for you. Please go to CassidyCash.com and download the free gift I have for you there. I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.